justified in destroying the wicked. There's nothing unfair or unjust in the destruction and the punishment of the wicked. They have earned the wrath of God. God, in fact, is love, and other than rebellion, he would love his creation. But because his creation rebelled against him and broke his commandments, he is justified in destroying the wicked. We asked the second question, that was how should Christians feel and think about the destruction of the wicked? And it's not necessarily what you think, and it's certainly not in line with what you hear in many circles today. And so we went through the first 6 verses of Psalm 68, and we looked at how the Spirit of God inspired David to write a song that the people would sing that talked about how they should cry out for deliverance, and they should cry out to God to come down and even destroy their enemies and those who mistreated them and continually took advantage of them. And then we see, this is new tonight, we'll start there in verse 7, we see how God had done that in the past. So the next part of the song, he transitions from talking about how it's right for the wicked to be destroyed for their wickedness, and how God's people should cry out to God to deliver them from wicked and evil people. And then we transition into this long section on how often God had already done that for the children of Israel, if you go back through their history. And so he takes them all the way back to when they came out of captivity in Egypt. We see this then in verse 7. O God, when you went forth before your people, when you marched through the wilderness, Selah, which is a transition in the song, the earth quaked, the heavens also dropped rain at the presence of God. Sinai itself quaked at the presence of God, the God of Israel. So he takes them back to the various periods. This is not the wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. This is actually when they first came out and they crossed the sea miraculously, and they are journeying to the promised land for the first time. And then this involves the time in which they receive the commandments from God that we know as the 10 Commandments. And God's glory rested on Sinai, and the ground quaked just at the presence of God. And so he's reminding them of that, how God has always been with them, how God has always delivered them, whether it was from slavery in Egypt or from their many foes they faced, even as they traveled to the promised land. They had to face many foes on that initial journey. And then he continues on in verses 9 and 10. You shed abroad a plentiful rain, O God. You confirmed your inheritance when it was parched. That's a reference to how God took care of them through all their wanderings, through all their times of distress, and how God always miraculously provided for them everything they needed. When all seemed lost, God would always come in and rescue them. He goes on, he says, your creatures settled in it, talking about finally entering the promised land. So he's kind of bouncing around a little bit, just talking about their history in various ways. The settling would be how they eventually did settle in the promised land. Again, only through the providence and care of God were they able to do that. You provided in your goodness for the poor, O God. And so again, he talks about not just as a nation, but God has always protected and provided for even the least of them individually. So he's going through and he's just reciting and reminding people, and they would be reminded of these things as they sang this song, that God had delivered them so many times in the past. He had been with them not only as a nation, but also as individual people. When all seemed lost, it wasn't, because God was with them and God could do all things. So it's kind of a strange way that the song goes at first, it seems. You know, he's talking about praying for the destruction of the wicked, how it's not a terrible thing, it's actually just and fair and right, how you should pray for deliverance from the wicked, pray that God would come down and deal with them. That is not something that you shouldn't pray. It's exactly what you should pray. And as you pray, you should believe that God will deliver you because of the past. He says you should believe this because God is a delivering God. Look at how many times he has delivered Israel. Look at how many times he has cared for the poor and the downtrodden when they had no hope and no strength to take care of themselves. And it continues on in verse 11. The Lord gives the command. The women who proclaim the good tidings are a great host. Kings of armies flee, they flee, and she who remains at home will divide the spoil. And you know, you look at these verses, and it's not, at first it seems hard to interpret 11 and 12, but 11 and 12 have a really simple meaning. And once you see it, you'll see it. He's talking here about when Israel would go out and fight, because they would face these foes that were bent on destroying them. And God would go before them, with them, and stay behind after they were done. And they would go and they would fight, and because God went before them and with them, they would always be victorious. And they would be victorious their victories were awesome. They lost very few men, and they really destroyed great armies. They laid waste to great kings. And most of these armies fled before them. And that last part, what he's talking about, is that God gave them such tremendous victories that they took tremendous spoils. And so the women stayed at home proclaiming good tidings while the men went out to fight, because their expectation was their men were going to come home, and they were going to come home victorious. And then, after the battle was over, they sat in their homes, and they divided up the spoils that the men brought home. That's all this is. It's a verse in the song celebrating how often God had given them tremendous victories, so much so that their women didn't even fret when their men went off to war. They just expected they were all going to come home. And that when they did come home, they would bring a large amount of spoil back that they would then sit in their homes afterwards and divide up. And that's, again, a verse in the song. So it's talking again about them praying and then being faithful and going out and facing these foes, these, first of all, enemies of God, and then by extension, enemies of God's people, and how God would give them victory over these wicked people who sought their destruction. And again, so much confidence that they didn't even fear going out to fight. They were so certain of the victory, they were just waiting at home so that they could count and then divide up the spoil. Everybody with me so far? You think the women of Israel were worried about praying for the destruction of their enemies? Think they felt bad? Of course they didn't. Why would they? They were supposed to pray that. They were supposed to pray to God that He would destroy their enemies. Again, it goes back to, like I told you last week, if somebody takes the life of one of my kids, I ain't telling them they're forgiven. I'm going to pray for their execution. You say that's wrong. Why is it wrong? David prayed for the death of his enemies, and guess what? God came down and killed his enemies. Right? Wrong? See, you still don't agree. You still don't agree. Because we've been told this thing that's not true. We've been told something that's not true. Throughout the Old Testament, you see it over and over again. The Psalms are filled. And keep in mind, the Psalms are the songs that the people sang. When's the last time you heard a modern praise and worship song that was faithful to the Bible, where they started out with the words, "Oh God, please come down and destroy my enemies"? You don't hear that anymore, do you? We've been programmed. What do you see in the Old Testament when you read the Psalms? Psalm after psalm after psalm, the opening verse is, "Oh God, please come down and destroy my enemies." Over and over again, that's what they sang. That's the biblical idea. That, if you have an enemy, you don't take vengeance for yourself. Who does vengeance belong to? God. Does that mean that because you shouldn't take vengeance for yourself, that you shouldn't pray that God would see justice done? It never says that. It says that you don't get to decide. You don't get to be the final judge. God is the final judge, and God gets to decide. Doesn't mean you can't cry out to God for justice, does it? Doesn't mean you can't cry out to God for deliverance, for protection. Doesn't mean that at all. That's why David, a man after God's own heart, when somebody sought to take his life, he wouldn't touch Saul, but he wasn't afraid to pray and ask God to take care of Saul for him. He wasn't afraid to pray and ask God to give him victory over the Philistines. He wasn't afraid to ask God to destroy the Philistines, because he knew that if something didn't happen, or if God didn't do something, the Philistines would destroy his people. And so he prayed that way because it was appropriate. If it's not appropriate, it wouldn't be in the Bible, and we wouldn't have this example to follow. This is not some error. It's the truth. It's the reality. You don't get to take vengeance against your enemies. You're to love your enemies, but you can ask God to deal with them justly and fairly and do whatever is necessary to protect you. That's what you should pray. You should pray for justice. There is nothing wrong with praying for justice. If you look closely, verse 12, I already covered verse 12. I'm getting a little bit behind there. Verse 19, blessed be the Lord who daily bears our burden, the God who is our salvation. So we'll jump down a few verses. We'll deal with verse 19 because 13 on is still this celebration of God's past deliverance where God had destroyed their enemies and answered to their prayers over and over again. And then you get down to verse 19, he's talking about blessed be the Lord who daily bears our burdens, how God constantly helps us to deal with the difficulties of life, the challenges of life, those who persecute us and mistreat us. God gives us strength to endure while we await justice from Him. He goes on, he says, the God who is our salvation. So again, he's just reminding, as they sing the song, he's reminding himself, the Spirit of God is inspiring him to write so that God's people would be reminded over and over again that even if you have to wait for justice, it's okay because justice will come. And in the meantime, God will help you to bear your daily burden. And ultimately, you always need to know that He alone is your salvation. So He is going to save you, and in the meantime, He's going to bear your burden. And this is not a reference, when it says salvation here, it's not a reference to being born again. This is a reference to being saved from your enemies. It's being saved from the wicked. So in the end, God is the one who will provide us our salvation from those who mistreat us. And in the meantime, He will give us what we need to bear our burden. He will not allow you to bear your burden, whether it's persecution or mistreatment. He will not allow you to bear it alone. He will bear it for you and with you. And that is the way in which you get, I think, strength and comfort while you're waiting on the Lord, is to know that He's not going to leave you alone in your suffering, and that eventually He will save you from your suffering. And again, if you're, I know I say it bluntly sometimes and people get offended, but tell me, the martyrs under the throne in Revelation, what are they crying out for? Justice. And what do you think they mean by justice when they're crying out? They're crying out for justice against those who took their lives for their faith in Christ. True or not true? That's exactly what they're crying out for. And they're already there. And that's what they're crying out for. These people took our lives for our faith in Jesus. We want justice. We want justice. We want you to deal with those who took our lives for our faith. That's exactly what's going on in Revelation, under the throne, under the altar. All right, so that's verse 19, verse 20. God is to us a God of deliverances. So this is the follow-up to verse 19. Again, shows you exactly what he means by salvation in verse 19. God is the one who is the God of deliverances. Did you notice deliverances is plural? Again, kind of going back to that second part of the song where he was going through all the different times God had delivered them from their enemies. And to God the Lord belong escapes from death. Also, God had spared their lives so many times. So he would deliver them by destroying their enemies. He would also then help them to escape. So sometimes they had these resounding victories, and sometimes they escaped, but they always were cared for by God and watched over by God. And he was not only their protector, he was also the one that gave them the strength they needed to face their foes. I think it was 2 weekends ago, Logan and I, we were up early in the morning before anybody else was up, and we were watching YouTube videos, and we kind of share same likes on a lot of things. And we like military history. I don't know if anybody likes military history, so we're watching some YouTube videos. You guys remember Sergeant York from World War I? If you're a history buff and you studied military, you know who Sergeant York is, right? So did you ever remember did anybody ever hear his story, how he got his Medal of Honor? Okay, I got to tell you this story. Now, he's a Christian man, okay? He initially did not want to go off to war because he didn't think it was right to take another man's life. He actually meets an officer in the army who's another Christian. These are devout Christian men. They love the Lord. They're very convicted. And he explains to him why it's wrong to be a pacifist, that in fact what he is doing is wrong, and if he comes and fights, he will be doing a greater good. And he convinces him eventually that it is a greater good to go and fight. So he finally agrees to go and fight. He goes off to war, and I think at this point he's a corporal, and they get sent on a recon mission to go out, and they're getting ready to do one of those big World War I charges where they charged into machine guns, and not the smartest thing in the world. His commanding officer says this is not the smartest thing in the world, so he sends him off and a handful of other men, and they get up to a certain area, and they've went a little farther than they probably should have, but they haven't run into any Germans yet. The next thing you know, there's a bunch of Germans on top of a hill, about 35, 40 of them, with a couple of machine guns. So a couple of his guys get killed. They retreat back, and he gets mad. So he goes up, and he crouches down in a stand of grass. If you ever know his story, he was just growing up, he was a hunter, and he was a really good shot. So they put him in. I mean, he can really shoot, and they've given him a better gun than he ever had before. And I mean, the man could really shoot. So he crouches down in this stand of grass, and he starts shooting. So every time a German head pops up, he shoots the German. He killed 22 Germans. He's in a stand of grass. Not behind a log. He's not behind a tree. He's in a stand of grass. When the battle's over, he's killed 20 Germans. He's captured 35 more by himself. And they went back, and this is one of the most investigated events in military history because nobody could believe it was true. In the grass on either side of where he was, the bullets had hit it so much there was hardly any grass left, but the grass directly in front of his position was completely clean. He dropped his canteen 6 inches from his body. His canteen had 18 holes in it. You know how many scratches Sergeant York had? 0. 0. You know what he said afterwards? They said, "Were you afraid?" He said, "No, God was with me. God brought me here, said he would protect me, and he did. He said he would allow me to slay my enemies. He did." Faith. Who was his protector? God. You want to know what happened that day? God put his great big hand down in front of Sergeant York. There ain't no bullet getting through that great big hand. Now, I'm figuratively speaking, right? But you get what I'm saying. Not a bullet was going to get to that man because God was with him. If God's with you like he was with Israel, that's to me one of the most vivid. I just listened to that story, and he gave all the glory to God. I mean, he was a devout Christian man. He gave all the glory to God. Later on, just a little bit about him, because I love history. He made a lot of money eventually doing speaking engagements. He originally did not want to do it. He just wanted to go home and farm. And there were kids where he grew up that had the same problem he did. They didn't even have a public school in the area. And he only had a second or third grade education. So he agreed to do speaking tours, took every dime, and built schools throughout the Appalachians so kids could go to school. For years, I think some of them still are, they were called York Academies. And he and his family lived on the farm that they always lived on. That's pretty cool, isn't it? But that's faith. He believed in a God who would deliver him. He believed in a God who would protect him. And that's what Israel's singing about here. The God who delivers and the God who protects. Now, again, people died. And people say, well, that's wrong. You think he did that by himself? He goes on, verse 21 through 23. Surely God will shatter the head of his enemies. Because again, the enemies of God's people are God's enemies. Surely God will shatter the head of his enemies, the hairy crown of him who goes on in his guilty deeds. The Lord said, I will bring them back from Bashan. He goes on, I will bring them back from the depths of the sea, that your foot may shatter them in blood. The tongue of your dogs may have its portion from your enemies. Now, this is graphic language. We definitely do not sing songs like this. This is extremely graphic language. Let's just go through it real quick. First of all, it talks about their confidence in God's deliverance, that they are confident that God will deliver them based on God's past deliverance. Their confidence in God has grown through the years as his people because they have seen God shatter the head of their enemies and the head of his enemies. They have seen God deal with those who are guilty of sin and depravity. And David is, in a sense here, not just singing about the reality of what God does with his enemies, he's also singing a song of praise. And it's going to pour on over into the next few verses, but we're going to skip down to verse 27 in just a second. But this is pretty graphic in 22 and 23. I will bring them back from the depths of the sea, that your foot may shatter them in blood. The tongue of your dogs may have its portion from your enemies. And I don't need to detail that, but basically, your enemies will be destroyed. God will see to it. He will deal with those who have mistreated you and dealt with you treacherously, is basically what they're reciting in this song. And they're going back again through their history of times when these really violent enemies came against them and God gave them the victory over them. In verse 28, your God has commanded your strength. So again, talking about how God is the one who gave them the strength to overcome and defeat these enemies. So ultimately it was God who destroyed their enemies, even if he used them to do so. Show yourself strong, O God, who have acted on our behalf. And so again, just praising God for all the deliverance, for the strength that he provides, and then humbly asking him to continue to provide that strength and that deliverance in the future. So in David's mind, this was just the way it was. I mean, they had enemies. They had people who wanted to destroy them and kill them, and they would cry out to God to destroy their enemies before their enemies could destroy them. And that is the world in which he lived. But there's no difference really in worlds. People are still the same even if technology changes. And so we need to pray for deliverance. We need to pray for strength. We need to trust God and wait upon God because vengeance belongs to the Lord. It's not my place. It's not your place. It's God's place because he alone is the righteous judge. So it's his authority, his power, his will. And then that all functions out of his purpose and plan. Now people will say, well, that was the Old Testament. We don't think or pray that way anymore. To which I say, that's not true. It's not just in the Old Testament. It's actually in the New Testament as well. Have you ever read 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 14? This is the Apostle Paul writing to Timothy. This is later in Paul's life, probably near his death. 2 Timothy was one of the last letters that he would write before his execution. And in it he says this, Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. So what's Paul talking about here? Justice. Alexander mistreated him and did him much harm. He's now expecting and waiting upon the Lord to repay him for what he had done to Paul. Paul's not executing justice or vengeance. He's trusting the Lord to. And I am certain, based on these words, that he and God have had some conversations about this, that he has poured his heart out and asked God that justice would be done, that God would deal with this man who had done him so much harm, a person who had made himself Paul's enemy. So Paul wasn't very happy with the coppersmith. And people will say, well, what about love your enemies? Well, you can still love your enemies and pray that God would deliver you from them. But just understand that when you pray for deliverance from an enemy, God alone will determine what that deliverance looks like. For some people, hopefully, if you share the gospel with them, and that should always be your first response, hopefully they will give their heart to Christ and find forgiveness for their sins and be filled with the Spirit and transformed. But some people just won't. And if you turn them over to God and ask God to deal with them accordingly, and that's what Paul says here, according to their deeds, God will deal with them in whatever way is best, because he alone is the one who knows what is the best way. And so you can love your enemies, and you can still pray that God would give you justice and deliverance. I mean, Jesus loved his enemies, and you realize that later on, he justly destroyed them. That's a tough statement, isn't it? But it's true. In fact, he even predicted the destruction of Israel in Luke chapter 23, beginning in verse 28. When Jesus is heading to Golgotha, he notices that some of the women of Jerusalem are weeping. They are sorry about what is being done to him. And listen to what he says to them. Jesus, turning to them, said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children." Now, why would they need to weep for themselves and for their children? He tells them exactly why. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, "Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed." Then they will begin to say, "To the mountains fall on us and to the hills cover us." For if they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? What happened? In 70 AD, the Romans encircled Jerusalem and killed almost every single man, woman, and child that was within the city. Who made that happen? God did. It was justice for what they did to his Son. Did Jesus love his enemies? Yes. Did he justly destroy his enemies? Yes. He's God incarnate, isn't he? And he knew the justice that was coming for them. That's what he prophesies here. And this is prophecy because he's telling them what is to come. And it came about 30 or so years later. 30 to 40 years later, it came. And Jesus told them that's what's going to happen. And so, again, you see this concept, and it's one of those things you have to really think about. It's complicated. How do you love your enemies and then still pray that God would do justly, that God would do righteously. Well, if God's going to deal with unrepentant people justly and righteously, it means their destruction. So again, if people ask you that question, what do you think about that? Say, well, it's right. It's just and it's fair. God in his righteousness deals with those who rebel against him and refuse to repent. I don't. It's not my place, but I do cry out to God for justice. I do ask God to repay those who mistreat me. I do ask God to save those who mistreat me, all at the same time. And it's not opposites. It's both and. That's why Jesus can look at them and have compassion on them and love them and at the same time announce their coming destruction. Because they're the ones that pick their path. And once they pick their path, those consequences are set. They're the ones who made the choice. They are making the choice, and they have then to deal with God. And eventually, everybody has to deal with God. And God is unchanging. He is set in his ways, and he will not change. And so everyone will face justice. And here's the beauty of the cross, though. And this is where I love this part. And I think part of this is we've lost the real emphasis and the real power of grace because we've so downplayed the cost of sin. We act as if people can sin and nobody should be upset about it, that there shouldn't be any consequence for it. If you sin, there is a price to pay. Somebody has to pay the price for your sin. There are consequences for your sin that usually affect more than just you. People suffer because of your sin. And we always act like our sin doesn't cause any suffering, but it absolutely does. It always causes suffering. That's part of the reason why sin is so terrible. Mostly it's terrible because it's rebellion against God, but it's also terrible from a human perspective because sin leads to suffering, and usually suffering for large numbers of people. And then we cry out for justice, but we sanitize that. We don't talk about the destruction of the wicked or God dealing harshly with the wicked. We just act like, it's just going to go away. And it's not, because people's hearts are what's wicked, and that's what continues to produce these wicked and evil actions that harm people and hurt people and often have pain and suffering that lingers for years, depending upon the action and what happened. So when you cry out for this, it's not wrong to cry out for it. It's not wrong for God to judge and to pour out wrath. In fact, it's just, fair, and righteous. The Israelites didn't have a problem with this. They understood. And when they wrote their songs under the direction of the Spirit and they sang them, they understood that God was their protector, that God was their deliverer, and that when their enemies came against them, it was either them or their enemies. And so they prayed that God would destroy their enemies. And they had no problem with that. They had seen it multiple times through their history where God gave them justice, deliverance, and protection, even allowing them to escape. Just pray. Pray and ask God. It's not for you, though, to decide. We don't get to take vengeance. We ask God to deal as only he can, to deal, as Paul said, according. I love that word, according. That's the right attitude to have. God, you deal according to what they have done. That way, if I've got it wrong and they didn't do anything wrong, praise the Lord. You don't have to deal with them, and you know that. But if they have done something wrong, I'm praying for you to do according to what they have done. Give me justice. Give me justice. And that's not wrong. It's absolutely biblical. Absolutely biblical. But don't you dare take vengeance for yourself, because then you're assuming the authority and the position of God. So love your enemies, pray for them, pray for justice. It's complicated, I know. But again, look to the Psalms as a guide. It's not just Psalm 68. There's a bunch of Psalms that go through this type of thing. David wrote a lot of them, but some of them are written by other inspired writers. You just see a trend there because the Israelites were accustomed to dealing with enemies. They were accustomed to being persecuted. And so they understood these things at a deep and profound level. If you've never been persecuted, you will understand these things far more after you're persecuted than you did before. But you'll also realize that you cry out to God and unburden yourself of whatever it is you're feeling, whether it's anger, bitterness, or resentment, and God will help you, he will strengthen you, and he will help bear your burden, if not just bear it for you. And he will eventually deliver you, and justice will be done. But it all resides within the hands of God. So we'll stop there. Again, we'll do prayer requests now, and then we'll close in prayer.